Welcome everyone to NSTA Web Seminars, live interactive learning at your desktop. Tonight's program is entitled Supporting the Implementation of the NGSS in Assessment, Implications of Research. My name is Alexandra Wakely. I'll be your moderator this evening. Our presenters are Marcelle Siegel and Ms. Joy Barnes-Johnson. Thank you for joining us. Our presenters this evening, Marcelle from the University of Missouri. She's an Associate Professor of Science. And Dr. Joy Johnson is an educator from Princeton Public Schools. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Joy to start our program.
Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Tonight we will be actually presenting one of the 8 position papers that is available online by the NARS leadership team, developed in 2013 in response to the publication and release of the Next Generation Science Standards. 8 papers are actually available. These papers actually allow us to better understand NARS, that is the National Association for the Research in Science Teaching's position on curriculum materials, informal science education, pre-service teacher education, professional development, accountability, engineering, equity, and assessment. Tonight, we'll actually be looking at assessment. The goals of today's session are simply to explore ways to shift assessment practice to meet the next generation science standards. And one of the ways that we hope to do this is to actually discuss ideas presented in the paper more directly. Finally, because we are practitioners, we will also spend some time actually sharing the resources from our research and classroom so that you have an opportunity to see how we put it into practice. So, critical issues and essential questions presented in the paper that was actually developed by researchers in Colorado and Chicago, Dr. Maria Ruiz Primo, Dr. Lou DeBello, and Dr. Guillermo Solana Flores, helped us to better understand why exactly it's necessary to think about assessment. And their ideas is that we need to explore student capital. In so doing, we're looking at assessment systems that is large scale as classroom level, formative and summative. We're looking at the context for assessment, looking at the purpose for assessment, and validity and fairness. So what conceptual frameworks actually allow us to explore that? Well, those frameworks are sort of drawn from essential questions. And the essential questions for the Next Generation Science Standards revolve around the 200+ performance expectations that are now there. So what then is required to develop assessment that are perfectly or semi-perfectly aligned to the performance expectations? And so in their discussion, they describe specific assessment targets, ideas around fairness and inclusion, integration into the classroom, and curriculum design. So what we want to think about is more directly what these performance expectations mean and reasons why, for example, we need to think about both the conceptual frameworks as well as these alignment goals. So performance expectations are the actual objectives that we expect students to accomplish. What will students know and be able to do as a result? So asking ourselves what they're able to know and be able to do, we think about what are our goals as teachers and targets of assessment. So clear identification of the target core ideas and performance expectations at the classroom level might engage us in questions like, what do students really need to know? If you've looked at the Next Generation Science Standards, you'll see a vast list of things. And what's awesome as a teacher is that we don't actually expect to go through, we're not actually expected to go through the list like a checklist of what students are able to do in a single year, for example. So identifying very specific core ideas and expectations is necessary as we think about assessment. The use of models for learning as unifying elements at the classroom level looks like what specific things we plan to teach, to what depth, and across what breadth. So the scope and sequence might, for example, be helpful in defining assessment targets. And then finally, as a teacher, you might ask, okay, is this sound and necessary as I go through these practices? In general, the big idea is that there are specific contexts and purposes for assessment, just like there are specific contexts and purposes for our teaching. And these provide opportunities for learning bridges and parallel visions to be established, not just for the teacher to the student, but all stakeholders in the building and in the community. Another big idea that's conveyed in this paper is this notion that classroom connections should be coherent, continuous, and comprehensive. Now what that looks like might be different, but the characteristics and the tools for this cohesion, coherence, and comprehensive curriculum is basically things that as practitioners we kind of do anyway when we're trying to meet the needs of students in our classroom. It looks like differentiated instruction and assessment. It looks like place-based or community-relevant instruction. It looks like diversity in the ways that we evaluate. It looks like technology-rich, but not necessarily dependent evaluation. It looks like rapid feedback. It looks like multimodal communication and opportunities for students to present ideas in a variety of ways. And most of all, it looks like a balance between skill development and challenging tasks. So no student on any given day is overwhelmed by either the volume of skills being developed, nor are they overwhelmed by the complexity of the task that they have a failure to reach what's theoretically called a place of flow or a zone of proximal engagement. Not just developing ideas, but actually engaging in narrowly focused tasks that allow them to achieve success. A core idea, though, that's presented is related to this idea of real, authentic tasks that can be evaluated in multiple ways. So especially in the case of the elementary grade, one of the ways that we can make connections to NGSS is through the Common Core. So, and another position paper on professional development will address that a little bit later. But the Common Core itself provides multiple opportunities for interdisciplinary habit development. In the case of multilingual learners, this is especially true because it is a place where students can move from active language or from passive language acquisition in the form of observing or just listening, taking notes, to speaking and actually writing in meaningful ways. So what we're going to do is actually walk through how the NGSS website can be used, or rather the documents that are generated from the NGS website can be used to help build Common Core lessons. So I'm going to actually take you for a moment on a tour of a short video that actually shows how you would use this document. So what I have prepared here is a short, it's coming live, I suppose. a short video that actually shows how you would use the NGSS website. I want to just explain, just yesterday, the website was changed, so it looks a little bit different. However, you're still able to identify a grade, a disciplinary core idea, and scroll down to find specific applications. What I'm showing here is a middle school list of performance expectations. These performance expectations are outlined so that you actually get a chance to see, first, the where it says develop models to describe. You're actually seeing the science and engineering practice before you move into the disciplinary core idea, before finally scrolling down to show the actual cross-cutting concepts. I'll actually put the link in the chat box to share so that you can do the same. So if you would, take a moment and actually walk through the video on your own.
Okay, Joy has put the link to that YouTube video in the chat box. Go ahead and use that website to check it out and look through, and then when you're back with us, go ahead and give us a yes or no, and I'm going to change our polling. So if you're back, go ahead and just give us a quick yes so that we can see that you're here. That's under the polling options under your name.
As you click through, one of the things that you'll actually get a chance to notice is that in the documents themselves, you get an opportunity to see Common Core standards. The Common Core standards are listed at the bottom to actually provide both mathematics as well as language, art, skills, and context.
Joy, for some reason we're not hearing you even though your mic is on.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is that better? Okay. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I'm sorry. So I'm going to move on and move on to the actual practices. So as you can see from the short video, when you use the website resources, the performance expectations pretty much read like our objectives. For those of us who can recall where we needed to identify what students will know and be able to do, it reads like objectives. And so the science and engineering practices actually start those statements. So the practices themselves, whether you're asking questions or developing and using models, the practices themselves are directly linked to information that tie math to science as well as to language.
Great. So now that Joy has reviewed the practices, let's peek into your classroom. So the question is, during assessments, which of the following practices would we be most likely to see? And we're just giving you a few examples, not all of the practices. But if you could choose one, A through D, and you're also welcome to choose E, and then let us know what your most common practice is in the chat box.
Remember, your polling option is the button underneath your name all the way to the right-hand side. You're going to choose letter A, B, C, D, or E.
Great, so I see a lot of responses for all of them. A through D, which is really nice because to have NGSS aligned assessment, of course, you want to use all the practices in your set of assessments. So not meaning in one assessment, but in all of your assessments over time. And we see the results. A is the winner. Recording evidence in notebooks and making arguments to support their explanations or designs. That's a great one. All right, so thanks for letting us know what you've been working on. And next I want to talk a little bit about the big ideas in the position paper that Joy talked about by Dr. Ruiz Primo, Dr. DeBello, and Dr. Solano Flores, because these are the big ideas that we're going to demonstrate examples of today. So the paper emphasizes developing assessments with attention to a couple of issues, and one of them is assessment targets that Joy talked about, and another one is fairness and inclusion. With assessment targets, they talk about things like identifying core ideas and performance expectations. And if you break this down, it's basically providing opportunities for three-dimensional learning. If you read the NRC reports on assessment, that's what's really emphasized, is that it's really important with our assessments to be providing opportunities for three-dimensional learning, meaning that you're blending the practices with the core ideas and with the cross-cutting concepts. Another thing that they talk about a lot is helping to monitor progress over time. And so this is in the NARS position paper as well as things like the NRC report. And it includes things like assessing over time in your own classroom as well as assessing over all of the grade bands. And then fairness and inclusion is discussed as well in the paper. It includes things like attention to language issues at all points in the development process, making accommodations for students, and using technological advances in testing. So how are we going to do this, and why are we doing this? Why are we thinking about assessment? Well, assessment's really important because assessment's what really drives learning. It really becomes a focus of instruction. And how are we going to do this? Well, the NGSS highlights practices, things like scientific knowledge through scientific reasoning, argumentation, inquiry, as opposed to understanding of scientific facts and procedures that we could assess with a typical test. So instead of a typical test that's boring and assesses memorization and test-taking skill, we have motivation with NGSS to assess in a more exciting, engaging way that's also more authentic to the way that science and engineering is done. And then this last point about cross-cutting concepts involves fostering learning over time through assessment. So for example, let's say that you assess structure and function multiple times in a year. So you would ask students to describe how structure and function relate when you're studying cells, and then you'd ask students to explain how structure and function relate when they're studying DNA, and then you'd ask them to describe how they relate when they're studying protein. And a student is going to begin to see how important structure and function is when you're assessing it over and over, and they can begin to develop a theme in their mind of having a great understanding of structure and function because they've seen so many different examples of it, and they've not only learned about them, but they're able to demonstrate their learning of those things. So next, let's discuss some tools that we can use to develop and choose assessments, and then we'll think about several examples of NGSS assessments from our own classroom work, so from Joy's classroom work and from my classroom works. So if we're choosing or developing assessments that align with the NGSS, here are a couple of tools that you can use. One is the Equip rubric. And I'm just showing you the part of this rubric that is focused on, assessment or monitoring student progress. And so the main points of this are three-dimensional learning with A, to be formative and use formative assessments and embed them through your instruction, to align rubrics and scoring guides that provide guidance for interpreting student performance, and then to assess with a lack of bias, or similar to equity and fairness. And for the assessment part of this is really useful for lesson planning, but you don't get a lot more detail with the assessment for this rubric, so I'm going to show you another rubric as well. And this is called a rubric of assessment for learning, and these are just 5 of the dimensions, but they're broken out into subcomponents that are a lot more detailed. And in fact, you wouldn't need to fulfill every aspect of this rubric. They're just suggestions for you to provide prompts for thinking about things that you could do if you're creating an assessment, or things that you might look for that would be positive if you're maybe evaluating an assessment to perhaps use. And it's not a perfect tool, but it has a lot of good prompts. We've gotten good feedback from teachers on it. So it's provided in the archive, the resource collection, and you can download the entire thing if you're interested in seeing the entire rubric. So next, let's take a look at some practical examples from our work. We're going to cover elementary examples, middle school examples, and high school examples. And then we'll think together about which pieces of NGSS are addressed in these examples. And I'm going to hand it back to Joy.
Joy, I think you just need to turn on your microphone there and press the talk button.
Oops. Thank you. So the examples that I'm sharing are actually taken from my time spent in an elementary classroom where I got opportunities to observe some of the things that we're actually talking about now. So we're actually going to describe in these examples opportunities for three-dimensional learning, fairness and equity, as well as how learning progressed over time from the fall through the spring of the subsequent year. So these samples are taken from my research, and so I'm going to have a lot of fun sharing with you. So here's an opportunity to actually ask you all what kinds of things you could see could happen outside. So here's a picture on a fall day in 2009 with a group of kindergarten students and their 2 teachers for a group of 9 students. So if you could, we're going to get a chat box up there. If you could type into the field space some details. What kind of lessons do you think could be planned? What kind of three-dimensional learning? What kind of science, practices, content, or cross-cutting concepts do you think we would actually be doing?
So you're just going to share your ideas here in the chat window as Susan's done, and I'll start typing away.
So thank you. I see great examples. Laura, sampling techniques for leaf counts. Thank you. Observation of trees and environment, rocks and landform. Bioengineering, changes to the environment, different species, abiotic and biotic factors. Absolutely. Interestingly, I want to point out that as I watch your engineering, as I watch your comments, there is significant language that could be developed. So interdisciplinary language development or vocabulary development would be key, especially in the kindergarten classroom. Patterns, weather, the relationship of patterns or interdependence of weather and habitat, environmental impact, human activity. Excellent. A few more, cause and effect. So actually, let me take you to show you what we actually did. So I have, this is a classroom in an urban school district where you have special ed and multilingual students in the same classroom. So you have 3 adults. One is a native Spanish speaker, one is a general educator, and one is a special education para. They actually created this display. So students collected plenty of samples. So I heard someone, or I saw someone put artifacts, listening to sounds in nature made by the trees and the wind and the birds. So to get to abiotic and biotic, you actually had some of that. Because as you can see over here on the right side, you'll see that the teachers actually recorded students' responses. And they had pictures. What you'll see at the bottom of the display are models of leaves and patterns, as well as actual leaves and patterns. Then you'll see samples where they were allowed to compare. And so very early in the school year that year, what students were able to do in this classroom was often replicated. So just to highlight, you had modeling for other teachers happen here. You had comparison between models, that is the cutout leaves, and real samples. You had a diversity of products, so students were able to articulate orally what they discovered. They were able to compare on plates or simply just put examples on the board and explain. And then finally, you actually have sort of a full range of creativity here. Some examples included pictures actually taken on that day as well. So with 3 adults in the room, certainly you get a nice range of potential things that you can do. But Jake, you are absolutely right. Low threshold and high ceiling. So you're able to have well-differentiated assessment as well as well-differentiated instruction. In that same classroom later on in the year, the teachers were able to build on the idea of producing examples of student work. Keep in mind, this is a kindergarten classroom, so students may not have developed fully their writing ability, and so the teachers record data on charts, and you actually see characteristics of assessment here. So questions form the basis of science experimentation. So that is the science and engineering practice. You'll see oral responses that are expected and valued by the teachers. You'll see teacher documents interwoven with student responses and student-produced responses. And then there's a variety of arrangements of accountability. So in some cases, for the student who might be new to the classroom and or have limited language proficiency, they're able to work in small groups. Then you have the whole group opportunities as well as the small individual accountability structures in this classroom. So particularly important for NGSS aligned assessment, especially at the lower grades, are these opportunities for whole class data collection that we see used over the course of the year. Now, in a first grade classroom, we had a different level of inquiry. So, which came first, the chicken or the egg? That was the question that the teacher posed, because this group of students oftentimes were used to doing science experiments primarily around food. So she posed this question to actually get them in the first and second grade, it was a blended class, to think about that question. In it, there was significant curiosity. That's what the pictures actually show from different sites, the children leaning in. So she shows just the chicken that we were able to achieve or obtain just from the market. And then she just did a simple dissection of that right in the class. Oh, I'm sorry, Carolyn. Is the mic better now? All right.
I think it sounds fine. Joy?
Okay, so big ideas and broad application were around this notion of structure and function, particularly of the chicken and the egg. What are some other ideas that, some of the other ideas that emerged from conversations around this could have been evolution, also looking at habitat and aging, nutrition, and those were all examples of how they would, over the course of time, investigate this question of chicken and eggs, to the point where this class, based on this chicken dissection, they would later go on to dissect not the whole chicken, but then just a chicken wing. Just the chicken wing. And that allowed them to understand structure and function relationships. They created a song that said, "Muscles move bone," by simply looking at a chicken wing. So every pair of students got a chicken wing, and they practiced looking at the relationship between the muscle structure and the wing structure. And it was just a fun set of experiments to watch. Again, building on high interest and curiosity, broad ideas. The great thing about being in the kindergarten, first grade classrooms is they had one teacher all day. So they did their science in the morning, where they dissected a chicken wing. Then midday, the teachers took the chicken, washed it, and built a story around meals, and put a crock pot on, a slow cooker on, and every child left that day with a pot of chicken soup. So it was just a lot of fun, and it was a very well integrated set of science lessons. So here actually is the set of standards that were later assigned to these tasks. We looked at how in the kindergarten class they use observation to describe patterns of what plants and animals, including humans, needed to survive. That same lesson applied from the plant as well as to the chicken. So you actually see how starting with the simple patterns of leaves actually translated into other survival lessons for animals. The second grade class, for the lower threshold students, they were just asked to make observations and compare them, whereas for the few students who were actually able to build arguments around their ideas, they were able to construct an argument and build discourse in the classroom around the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg.
All right, thank you, Joy. This is Don Boonstrom. I'm going to jump in here now and give some time for a couple of questions. If you do have some questions, please type them in the chat window, and I'll just gather them in and send them over to either Joy or Marcelle. Okay, how are teachers documenting individual progress? I think that's for Joy.
In that particular lesson, in the kindergarten classroom, the paraprofessional was asked to actually maintain a science journal for every student. So many of the individual responses that you actually saw on the side with the small sheets of paper were examples from individual students over time. For example, they did an apple study, and they looked at apples several days in a week. And so one by one, the students actually got a chance to talk to the para, and the para just documented. And so that was one of the ways that they were able to document. So that actual science notebook or science journal that the para documented was one way. In the older student classroom, so in the second grade classroom, students were actually asked to repeat the experiment twice. So it was almost like a pre-post scenario in that classroom. So the first leaf discussion was just a fall field trip outside. And all they were asked to do was to observe patterns before being given any vocabulary or any details about symmetry. That teacher tended to tie her lessons to math. And from there, she was able to document how their thinking changed over the course of the study.
And we did have a question.
I did see the question also earlier, and I'd like to respond to it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, about the three, aren't all things three-dimensional. I'm sorry, Ted. Yes, So that actually was in reference to Marcelle's slide where she shows the 5 components. But yes, all assessments should be 3-dimensional, but you realize when you are evaluating instruction, the instruction itself is 3-dimensional, and you can focus on a specific science and engineering practice within a specific DCI, and you can look at 1 or 2 cross-cutting concepts, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I wanted to respond to that too. I wasn't sure which slide the question was about, but I looked at a couple of them, and it might be about. And just focusing on 3-dimensional learning, does everything have to be 3-dimensional? I mean, that's the goal, is that you want to have 3-dimensional assessments. But the recommendations for how to do that is this one. Okay. The third bullet is here. So the recommendations for how to do that are that you'll often need to split your assessments into components. So you can have one, like an assessment task, and then with one question you'll be focusing on practices. With another question you'll be focusing on core content. And that it's okay to split up your assessments into different questions, and the questions might not be, each question might not be 3-dimensional, but if you build them together, that they will be. Also, that bullet was just intended to say that we're moving on to different types of assessments. It's not just about memorization and things that are not related to the real world. NGSS is also very tied to thinking about authentic science and authentic engineering, and so we want our assessments to also be that way as well.
I think maybe if we move on from here, we can still gather up some of these questions later on and certainly at the end. And I think along the way, you're probably going to be giving examples of questions that could be coming up at a dimension. So if Joy and Marcelle, you could at least think of that question as you move forward, I think we probably should move forward just to keep us from being here 5 hours, because this is very, very deep stuff, and we could be here a long time talking about this because it is good.
Okay, so yeah, I appreciate your questions. Thank you. So now I would like to actually share some high school chemistry examples, again with the emphasis on opportunities for 3-dimensional learning, fairness and equity, monitoring progress over time. In my current assignment, I am a high school teacher, and so as a high school teacher, I actually get a great opportunity to work with a range of students in terms of ability and giftedness, cultural diversity, and linguistic diversity. And so the examples that I'm sharing now are actually from my current group of students and their practices in my high school chemistry class. So I'm actually going to share a Prezi. Now Prezi, if you're familiar with Prezi, is a web-based presentation tool. Well, I'd like to point out how Prezi can be used in a high school chemistry classroom to actually explore structure and function of molecules. So students, for example, created and did research on a cool compound. Before I actually start the Prezi, I want to show you the benefit of the Prezi. I just shared the link in case you want to go through it yourself. On the screen, you'll see that Prezis will allow you to generate a transcript. Once the text has been entered by the student, you, the teacher, can actually see and give comments on the transcript, including the full transcript, so that you begin to sort of see what kind of language they're using and what kind of connections they're making. Additionally, you're able to provide comments. There are no comments shown here, but this is an authentic assessment as it connects to an authentic audience. Once the Prezi is online, anyone can make a comment, excuse me, anyone can make a comment so that students are able to actually see how they are engaging ideas related specifically to their research. They're able to use a variety of representations for very specific content, allowing you to understand what students are saying. So this is particularly important for multilingual students. You're able to develop a range of vocabularies and sort of assess students' ability to go very deeply into an idea, or whether or not their understanding is just shallow. So here, tying it to careers and some authentic purpose, research, and so on, this was what I used to actually have students then connect to why we care. Always answering the question, so why do I need to learn this? That is, I think, probably the hardest challenge when we think about why it is that we teach some sophisticated ideas. And so, having said that, I used Prezi. So I also have a link to the rubric. As you may wonder, okay, so what did she actually use to evaluate students? I'm going to share the link to the rubric here as well so that you can actually see. So I actually intentionally tie the acronym CCC to the compound as a reminder to me and my colleagues of why we do some of this work. And so this statement is taken from my actual assignment. The cross-cutting concepts that I explored here are the investigation of systems, specifically the structure of and components of a molecule, asking them to communicate their ideas, and here were the objectives. I directed students specifically to use these tools, trying to get them away from Wikipedia and just a basic Google search, and here's how they were able to secure points. So I saw a question, do you create Prezis or do students? I believe the students create the Prezis. So, but I create one as a template from which they can follow. So the example that you were shown or that you see is one that I created, and the Prezis that the students created were generally much better than mine. They're fascinated by the technology and were often very much more creative than I was able to be. So what you see here then is an example. So this is an example of a student-produced Prezi, the transcript that's created, and then the individual feedback. Misconceptions that might exist in the Prezi, I'm able to provide in very narrowly focused feedback that I give to the students. So to get back to points from the paper, rapid feedback is probably the most significant tool that we can use. And when you're doing technology assignments around the specific practice of communicating ideas, I find that it is so much easier to get that done. So I'm going to turn it over to Marcelle now.
All right, thanks, Joy. That is so cool. So next I'm going to show you an example from another high school chemistry topic. And in this recycling rust assessment, we are using STOIC with a real-life example to gauge students' understanding, to see if they can make money if they recycle rust. And so you're taking a unit, stoichiometry, which if you're a chemistry person, you may know is usually taught in a very formulaic way, and bringing it into the real world, which NGSS encourages us to do. And with a topic that will hopefully be a little bit more intriguing to students. And you can use it in a group setting or in an individual setting. I'm going to describe it briefly, and you can download the full assessment from the resource collection, which the link for that will be shown at the end of the session if you're interested. So students are recycling a pile of rust back into iron, and they use aluminum, zinc, and copper as reactants. They have to balance 3 equations. They convert the mass of the metals into iron, and then they figure out how much money they can get from selling the recovered iron. And they have to justify if this makes financial sense, which is an engineering type of reasoning, and they find out that it does not. So in this assessment, we see opportunities for three-dimensional learning, in that there are practices, there are core ideas, and there are cross-cutting concepts. So with the practices, we have students planning an investigation. So they have to decide on reactants, they have to consider limitations of the reactions, and we're using mathematical and computational thinking, and as well as thinking about cost effectiveness. It covers the DCI of chemical reactions, physical science. And then the cross-cutting concept, the main one used for here is patterns. And it also covers a bit of systems and energy and matter, of course. And this last bullet on here is a typo. You can ignore this because this is not. I'm just going to cover over it. That's not the appropriate wording of that. So let's pause for a minute and use your emoticon tool to tell us how you're feeling so far.
So the emoticon tool, thank you, Marcelle. The emoticon tool is going to be underneath your name. It's the one all the way to the left-hand side, and your choices are indicated there for smiley face or anything else that you're feeling right now. There we go. We got Christopher approving. Thank you, Christopher. And Julie and Christy. We have one confused person. Oh, but they're not confused anymore. And Don did point out that for mobile users, the emoticon is below the main window. I realize these are not, wide range of emotions here, so if you want to go ahead and tell us how you're feeling in the chat window. If you do have a question, make sure that you hold on to it because we will have time for a question and answer period coming up pretty soon. Okay, Marcelle, I think if you want to go ahead and continue, it'd be a good time to do that.
Great, thank you. So the next assessment that I'll show you fits with middle school physical science, and it's related to the DCI of energy. And it begins with some friends going on a camping trip, and they have sudden snow that they weren't prepared for, and they didn't bring any water, and so it's time to melt some snow. The assessment asks the students to think about how they can get water by using the items that they have. And the assessment provides misconception alerts for teachers, suggestions for teachers of how to lead the discussion. After they do a particle diagram to show the microscopic status of the objects, there's a link for teachers to go to the Concord Consortium and show us a simulation that provides a visualization of particle movements. And next, students will draw a particle diagram of oil, and this is just an example of oil. And then there are prompts with diagrams and with sentence starters showing how they can fill in the diagram to show particle movement. And we're not going to have the video available tonight. I'll just tell you a little bit more about what happens in this classroom. So it's difficult to represent movement of particles. And the teacher starts talking about this, and she shows them an example on the board of a way to do this. She also draws on the board, showing them different examples. She asks them how to represent structure. And then she asks them how we can model ice on the whiteboard. She uses questions to help her students understand and to find out what they're thinking about. And then she has them draw graphs. So they're drawing time temperature graphs on whiteboards. And they have a class discussion where the teacher compares the different graphs that they've made. They talk about time difference for phase changes. And towards the end of the video, she talks a little bit about the importance of student collaboration. So she does a really nice job of modeling in this example. So let me ask you, if you could type in the chat box, to see in this brief example of an assessment, what aspects of NGSS do you see addressed? You can think about NGSS practices, so we already mentioned modeling. You can look at the performance expectations and provide particular ones. You can think about equity. Were there any equitable strategies being used? Wonderful. So we're seeing stability and change with state changes, science and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, some core content areas, an authentic application. More specifically, we're modeling the movement of particles. We're thinking about state changes. We're using multiple representations. So the teacher used whiteboarding techniques. She used paper and pencil techniques. She went around from group to group to discuss with each group. And another important practice is argumentation. Great. So let's look at a few more of these. And these are the performance expectations that we see being addressed. So students had to plan an investigation. So we didn't go through all of that, but part of the assessment was to actually come up with an investigation to melt the ice and then determine the relationships among the energy transferred. They also had to construct and present arguments to support a claim about energy. And then the main practices are developing and using models, investigations, and engaging in argument from evidence. And several DCIs are covered as well. I won't list all of these, but several from energy, conservation of energy, defining and delimiting an engineering problem. And then cross-cutting concepts, we're also thinking about scale, proportion, and quantity, and energy and matter. So thinking about the paper, aims of the paper, and thinking about assessment, we have opportunities for three-dimensional learning because we've hit the DCI and the practices and the cross-cutting concepts together. We have several opportunities for fairness and equity, and you just got to see a couple of these. But one of the things I wanted to mention is there's a lot of scaffolding provided in this assessment. So there are the prompts that are given, there are diagrams, there are pictures to introduce the assessment, to introduce a real-life situation, a motivating context. Students have a choice of modes of communication in a couple of the questions that they're given. And there's an opportunity for rich language practices in both the discussions that they have, the oral discussions, as well as the written writing that they do. We also see a chance for monitoring progress over time, especially if you look at this teacher over time in her use of modeling, because she's really helping build up a good understanding of how to represent things. She asks students to compare different representations, to compare different models, and there are many assessments that ask very similar questions about modeling, which gives us a nice sense of student progress over time. So we've been talking about some very basic things related to NGSS and assessment, three-dimensional learning, and equity, and progress over time. And these can be challenging when you're changing your instruction. But I also want to encourage us to think about how to go further. So what are some ways to go further than the things that we've talked about so far? So you might think about some things that you do in your own classroom that you think really addresses NGSS very well. You might think about different goals of the NGSS related to equity in assessment, related to authentic practices of science and engineering in assessment. And let us know if you have ideas about how to take this even further than what we've talked about before.
Marcelle, this is Don. There are a couple of questions earlier that I think may be holding people up from going further, and maybe you could help to clarify on that. There were two of them in particular. One was all of this feels more like instruction than assessment. Is that the point about NGSS assessment, that it shifts our perception of what assessment looks like? And also a related question, perhaps I'm not understanding that there doesn't seem much of a difference between assessment and instruction. How do we define the line between them?
Right, so that's a great point. So one of the major shifts with the NGSS is that assessment needs to be embedded with your instruction. So if you look at a lot of the other recommendations of how to achieve effective assessment with the NGSS, you'll see discussion of something called seamless assessment, which is the idea that your instruction and your assessment go together in your classroom. You may be able to walk into someone's classroom and there's not a change. When someone's given a test, for example, in the old traditional way of doing things, you may say, okay, everyone's taking a test and assessment is happening. And then you may see instruction happening in a different scenario. But with this shift, there's a much closer connection between instruction and assessment. So it's good that you're seeing that. It's good that you're seeing in examples that it's hard to draw the line between what is instruction and what is assessment. So that's a positive thing. If you have other particular questions about that, we can get into your questions as well. Do people have more specific questions about that, or does that help so far?
Carolyn had a question, Ms. Marcelle. Was the teacher looking at each student's representation of the molecules, not sure when the teacher could assess the student's understanding?
Yeah, so it was a formative assessment cycle, for example, what I was just talking about with the modeling heat assessment. So there's a lot of different aspects to this assessment, which would take a long time to show you all the different aspects. You can download the full assessment with teacher recommendations from the archive and see it. And we'll also be sharing with you the I don't know if it's happened yet or not, I didn't notice. In the chat box, we'll be sharing with you the link to a video to watch an excerpt. And again, it's just an excerpt. It shows you pieces of the assessment and pieces of the instruction happening. So to be a little bit more specific also, when is the teacher looking at? So with this one, this is a written question, and the teacher has time to look over all of the student responses. With the whiteboarding, it's done as a class discussion, so the teacher has time to look at it. And then the teacher the next day, they keep the whiteboards up, and the next day they also go back to the whiteboards and discuss them again and compare the whiteboards so that all the students can see how the graphs are different. All right, so does anyone have ideas about how to go further than the types of things we've talked about so far with the NGSS? I haven't noticed any yet. I'll just mention a couple of them to think about. Formative assessment is really important with the NGSS. So it really encourages teachers to use assessment formatively to inform their own instruction. It encourages us to look at student work and have students be metacognitive about their own learning and use assessments to push their own learning forward. It encourages us to really use assessment as a way of supporting learning. So that would be one thing to think about that we could spend a whole webinar on just talking about that, how to go deeper with formative assessment. Another thing to think about is if we think about equity and we think about how to make things authentic. This is a quote from Siegel and Barton about performance assessments. And what if we think about performance assessments as being closely tied to a local concern or a local need or a local problem? And then we act to solve that problem or we act to make a difference in the world, take action with something. For example, you could have a problem at a stoplight with there being a lot of traffic accidents, and it's a problem of an actual community. And students go out and collect data on what's going on at the traffic light. They discuss their data, they interpret their data, they come up with an actual investigation of how best to collect this data and what kinds of data sources need to be collected and how much data needs to be collected. And then they use some of the other practices, connect it to core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. So next, let's go to a high school biology example. And we'll talk again about three-dimensional learning, fairness and equity, and monitoring progress over time. So this is about genetically modified organisms. And GMO OMG is a really interesting documentary that you could use as part of your instruction. If you Google GMO OMG, if you're interested in this topic, you can get a free preview of the movie to see what it's about. And we use this as a context to really blend learning with the NGSS and to include some argumentation and critique of media. So students were critiquing the movie while they were learning about the content of how we genetically modify organisms. So in traditional biotechnology, we can use organisms to make a product, like we can make bread using fermentation, or we can breed sheep. And in modern biotechnology, we can actually go in and put in a gene from one organism into another organism and produce an entirely different organism. So next I'm going to show you some of the assessment questions that we used. And you can think about what would these assessments reveal about an understanding of genetically modified organisms, and as we're looking at these questions. So you can see on the left side questions that really focus on media literacy. Who made and sponsored this message? For what purpose? What's the target audience? How are messages communicated? And on the other side, we see a lot of science and society types of assessments. So what are some concerns regarding our reliance on GMO corn for much of our diet, for example? So we can use a chat box with this one and think about what sorts of NGSS could be addressed with questions like these. All right, so we see these practices like engaging in argument from evidence, practices like obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And we want to have time for more questions at the end, so we're going to move on to begin our conclusion, and I'll hand it back to Joy.
Thank you. So where do we go from here? I think as a practitioner who is actively thinking about NGSS and research about NGSS, that's the question. So what I'd like to do is actually move into some of the discussion. Again, assessments that are equitable will include opportunities for students to discuss ideas in a range of, or variety of arrangements, so that if they have no context, then they can build out from there. So I want to share an example recently of the Flint water crisis and take you on a little tour of how that might be represented linguistically. Embedded in an exercise around the Flint water crisis, we looked at Compound Chem, which is a wonderful chemical and engineering news resource, and they developed an explanation of the Flint water crisis. So examination allows you to see the balance of information as well as text. So here you can see how you can build out for group projects, so students who are artistic, so you can address learning styles, and as teams of students begin to deconstruct larger ideas that may have been taught, you can apply things like acid-base reaction. Okay, your screen is blank. Here's the link. Acid-base reactions, solubility rules, the concept of redox, as well as tying this to geography. You can tie this to history and how this is generally a problem not just in Flint, but everywhere in the United States, or multiple places in the United States. You could also look at water quality in general, talk about arsenicosis and well water differences, and a variety of different things. So compound interest provides great infographics for students to use. Another example is from history, looks at a very familiar example of reclaiming metal. It's slightly different from the one that, or significantly different, but not really, than the example that Marcelle shared around recycling rust. And this actually ties again to history and World War II, so that you could talk about how gold was reclaimed after World War II. And having students talk about this, it built for us a basis for doing copper recycling, or the Copper Cycle Lab, if you're familiar with it, where we're using very, very dangerous reagents, but they're actually seeing, you can look at reactivity series, solubility, on. So finally, if you have students that are fascinated, for example, with once they know a little bit of nomenclature, organic nomenclature, they may begin to start saying, oh, okay, well, what's going on with, what's the name of that show? I think it was called Breaking Bad, and they will begin to think about mess. And very disturbing is this recent, recent challenge to student understanding around do shine. So all of these are bases for students to actually talk in the high school classroom around topics of interest, very high interest and curiosity to them. I'll turn it back to Marcelle.
Thank you. So developing assessments is hard, and developing assessments for the NGSS can be very challenging. So one thing I want to encourage you is just to get started with it. You don't have to start having the most perfect assessments. You can start by modifying assessments that you have. You can think about, is there a way that I can focus on a DCI and go deeper to find out about students' deeper conceptual understanding. You can think about adding a practice to an assessment that you already have. Maybe you have an assessment that's already pretty good at being three-dimensional. Can you add, one more practice to it, or can you make a cross-cutting concept more explicit within your assessment? It's okay to use multiple questions. So like we talked about, you don't have to have one assessment question and the entire thing is three-dimensional. You can have an assessment task and it has multiple questions within it, and they focus on different things. One focuses on content, one focuses on practices, etc. I think practice is a great way to get started. It really, I think, if you're thinking about how to add practices to your assessments, it's going to really give you a good emphasis on reaching the aims of the NGSS. And like we talked about, repeating the cross-cutting concepts can be really effective for student learning. So Mr. Bubble, he has a recurrent nightmare. Let's not do a text box writing because we're low on time now, but just take a minute to think about what Mr. Bubble's nightmare means to you. What are some of the negative feelings that come up when you think about the word assessment? And I want to leave you with the idea that assessment can seem intimidating. It can be intimidating for us as teachers. It can be intimidating for students, but it doesn't have to be that way. The NGSS really emphasizes assessment for learning in contrast to assessment as a measuring stick and as an intimidation tool. And if we think about this quote from Resnick many, many years ago, it really gets at a lot of the authenticity that NGSS is focusing on. Thank you so much for joining us. And we want to, again, highlight that we'll be sharing a resource collection that has many papers and links, many of the things that we've talked about today, to provide more details and explanation from the ideas that we discussed, as well as going beyond what we discussed today that are important aspects of NGSS in assessment. And these are some of the links that will be available. And I'd like to give a big thank you to NSTA and NARS for this opportunity. We'd especially like to thank Alexandra Wakely, who helped us out with a lot of preparation for this webinar, as well as our moderators, who were very helpful for us tonight. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and contributing to our discussion. And I will hand things over to our moderators.
Thank you so much, Marcelle and Joy. Everyone that joined us tonight, I feel like we had just a wealth of information, so many things that I learned, and information that is available to you. We're going to flip back just to this resource page just real quick. You may want to take a screenshot of your computer, or just even if you have a smartphone handy, take a quick picture of this slide. The collection that's going to be sent to you this evening, you're going to get a link from us for the collection, and inside of that collection is the actual presentation for this evening. So if we went too quickly or not quickly enough, for some of you maybe, but you can always go back and access this through that collection link. And then again, here's the second page with resources if you'd like to go ahead and copy that. It looks like Don is putting those into the chat window as well, if it's easy for you to cut and paste into, say, a Word document, whichever you prefer. I would like to thank today's presenters. Excellent job, a lot of good information from Marcelle and Joy both. And also thank you to the sponsor of tonight's web seminar, NARS, I know that perhaps many of you before this program didn't know about the position papers for NARST, and maybe weren't even familiar with the organization at all. So I know we got a lot of good information this evening from them. I'd also like to thank the National Science Teachers Association, especially our Executive Director, David Evans, and our Associate Executive Director of Services, Mr. Al Byers. We'd also like to thank the NSTA Web Seminar team. We have several different web seminars coming up in the future. If you're interested in this program specifically, you should definitely register if you haven't already. For the other programs coming up sponsored through NARST. This is not the entire list. This is as many as we could fit on this slide. We have several coming up in the next few weeks that are really exciting. So definitely check out the full listing at that web address below. And before we stop the recording, I'm going to go ahead and put back that second page of resources for everybody to see. I got that question there. It looks like Don went ahead and posted that in the chat window for us, so thank you, Don, for taking care of that. At this time, I'll be stopping the recording, and we'll be putting up the program evaluation. Don't leave just yet. We do want to give you the link for that, and I'm going to ask Don, do you have a second to put up the collection link? I don't know if you have that handy. Here we go. So the collection link is there in the chat window. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.